Hello and welcome everyone to the National Association of Enabling Educators Australia webinar series for 2023 and our webinar today of supporting students to meet learning outcomes, generative AI and assessments in enabling education. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which I'm coming from for you today, which is the Noongar Whadjuk people in Boorloo, Perth, and pay respects to elders past and present. I think it's really important for all of us to acknowledge the current national discourse around the voice to Parliament in particular, and for each of us to really consider how we're engaging in factual information and respectful conversation, and also supporting our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and students and community members. My name's Fiona Navin. I'm an executive member of the National Association of Enabling Educators Australia and the Director of Access and Equity at Edith Cowan University. And so welcome. So Liz, if we could just jump through to the next slide. Thanks. So the National Association of Enabling Educators Australia aims to create a shared platform for tertiary educators across the sector to work to promote widening participation and enabling education, and to foster really exchange of ideas and support for collaboration on good practice in enabling, but also higher education more broadly. So NAIA is a membership organisation. Membership is only $80 and there's lots of benefits to membership, including participation in a whole range of special interest groups, regular updates on what's happening in the enabling sector. There's professional development opportunities, small grants that are available, as well as collaborative research projects that occur across the association, and a biannual conference. And indeed, it's the collaborative effort of members of our assessment special interest group that we're able to provide this webinar to you today. So if you're not a member of the National Association of Enabling Educators Australia, I'd really encourage you to join. You don't have to be solely an enabling educator. We know lots of good practice comes from enabling education, so encourage you to consider if you'd like to be linked in with practitioners across Australia and also New Zealand. I would like to also take this opportunity to promote our next webinar as well, which is Towards Critical Enabling Pedagogy, How Collective Action Research Has Impacted Teaching in Higher Education. So this will be put on by our colleagues at University of South Australia, and there's a QR code to register, but I'll also put a link in the chat for you if you'd like to register. Finally, onto some protocols for our webinar today. You might note that your microphones and cameras are currently off, and they'll remain off as our presenters provide their presentations, but at the end will be turned on again so you can ask any questions or provide any feedback or comments to the presenters today. Throughout the webinar, you can post questions in the chat, and encourage you to do that. We'll be monitoring those questions to put them to the presenters at the end. And finally, the webinar today will be recorded and available on the NAIA website and also socials after the event. And so if you need to take a break or anything during the webinar, you can do that as well. I will now hand over to Liz and James, who are the coordinators of the Assessment Special Interest Group, and they will be facilitating the webinar today. Thanks, Liz and James.
All right, thanks very much for the introduction, Fiona, and I'd like to welcome everyone as well to today's NAIA webinar on supporting students to meet learning outcomes, generative AI and assessment in enabling education. So my name is James Valentine. I'm a lecturer in the Tertiary Enabling Program at Charles Darwin University. And as Fiona just said, I'm one of the leaders of the Enabling Assessment Special Interest Group. So I'll be one of the hosts today. The other host is Liz, and I'll hand over to Liz and talk to you later on.
Hi everyone, thanks for that, James, and welcome. So lovely to see you here. I'm just going to do a really quick introduction because I'm sure you're all much more keen to hear from our wonderful presenters today. But, you know, as you all would all know, the purpose of assessment for us as educators, we want to be able to provide evidence that students are meeting learning outcomes, and at the same time, we want assessments to be able to promote and support student learning. But the launch of generative AI tools like ChatGPT, which only emerged, I think, less than a year ago, 30th of November 2022, has given rise to a lot of questions about how we continue to do this in the future. And you can see some of these questions on the screen, and I'm sure it's raised many, many more for you. So we're not going to be able to answer all of the questions, or maybe even definitively answer even one question today. Today's webinar is instead about starting a conversation. And we want to kickstart that, provide a window into some of the work that our colleagues at various institutions have already been doing and thinking about in terms of generative AI assessment and enabling education. So we have 5 wonderful and varied presenters today who are going to talk about different aspects of genAI assessment and enabling education. As Fiona mentioned, please feel free to post any questions in the chat as we go, and we'll have time for questions after all panelists have presented for us. So I'll introduce our first speakers to get us started today. Our first 2 presenters are John Pike and Tamara Alpin. John is a lecturer at UniSA College who teaches information literacy and digital literacy. And Tamara is a senior lecturer also at UniSA College who teaches English as an additional language and is an academic integrity officer. Their presentation focuses on examples of how genAI might be integrated into 2 subjects with different focuses, so information literacy and also English language studies. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John, who will then pass over to Tamara.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, Tam and I will be going through the way that we've been approaching generative AI in our courses or units. So earlier this year, we did identify a few problems, and I guess principal among them was that students were very confused about what was acceptable with generative AI and what was not acceptable. A lot of the discussion about generative AI has this academic integrity framing, which is really important, but it also does tend to imply illegitimacy. But we didn't want students to be hiding that away from us. We wanted them to be able to talk to us quite openly about how they wanted to use it, if they did want to use it. The big challenge, though, is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to using generative AI or implementing it or approaching it. So different courses or units are going to have different learning objectives, and what works in one won't work in another. So we decided to take a very transparent and open approach in our courses. So I'll talk about my information literacy course called Future Ideas. Tam will talk about her English language studies course. And front of mind for us as we've been doing this is our learning objectives in these respective courses and keeping assessment validity in mind. So basically the guiding question for us is, if generative AI can be used, can students still demonstrate that they've achieved the learning objectives in these courses? So first of all, my course here called Future Ideas, because it's information literacy, I really needed to embrace generative AI to some extent because it is this new way of interacting with information. So I've taken this critical AI literacy approach. The course is underway now. We're in week 8 at the moment. It's a 13-week course. And so I took this, I put an early emphasis on the limitations of AI tools to say what they're sort of good for, but what they're not so good for as well. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. I'll also go through some formative activities that I've developed to demonstrate acceptable uses, and some guidance I've given students on the use of AI in their assessments as well. So I need to go through these slides very quickly for time, but I'm happy to share the slides with anyone who might be interested and might want to follow up later. So first of all is, this is a slide from the week 2 lecture. So very early in the course, I addressed generative AI this whole week, because it in fact was about artificial intelligence. So early on, just after explaining what generative AI is, I pointed out these limitations. So the output is based on statistical probabilities. These tools don't understand meaning. They don't know anything. They can't do analysis. They tend to make things up, and they are fundamentally biased because of the way the technology works and their training data. So I identified all these limitations, but then kind of turned around and said, but we are going to use them in this course in some ways, because they can still be useful tools as long as we understand these limitations. So this is the sort of critical AI literacy approach of identifying these limitations, and also I went on to discuss some broader kind of social impacts of these tools as well. And so following on from that, this was a week 2 activity where I got students to look up this topic here about the level of Antarctic sea ice in 2023, which was a news story a few weeks ago. And so they needed to use a generative AI tool and a traditional search engine to find information on this topic. And the idea was to bring up what are the benefits and the limitations of these types of tools. So what can you do with one? What can you do with the other one? What should you look out for? So that brought up things like it's harder to identify the ultimate source of information with an AI tool. And because it's a 2023 topic as well, it also brought up the limitation of the free ChatGPT, which is limited to 2021. The following week, what students do in this course is they have to come up with their own research questions for their assessments. And I found that these AI tools are actually really good at developing narrow research questions. So I turned this into an activity for them to do in week 3. So this is an example here. This is Bing Chat here. It's not flawless. It gave some decent questions. This one here about rooftop solar in the Snowy Mountains hydro scheme didn't seem to make much sense. So you still have some problems, but I found for the most part it is really useful for developing narrow research questions, and that also was demonstrated in their assessments as well. So if they did use this activity here, they tended to have very nice narrow research questions. So this was really successful. That's the full activity there if anyone wants to follow up later. The following week, week 4 of the course, was about how you can find high quality academic sources. So I gave them some AI options here. So they didn't have to use AI for this purpose, but these were just options available to them. So using AI to think up keywords and synonyms that they might use in the library catalogue or Google Scholar and other search engines. And also for refining the search syntax that they might use in search engines as well. I found that one was a bit hit and miss, but I decided to give them the option anyway, but included this warning down here that they should use that as a brainstorming tool and not as necessarily the correct answer. This was about brainstorming a topic. So this prompt here was designed to get the AI tool to kind of interact with the students. So I'll ask a question first, and after you respond, you ask me for my thoughts. So it instructs the tool to kind of have this back and forth dialogue, prompting each other for questions and responses. And I included an example there using ChatGPT for that purpose. And I found that, again, the tools are quite useful for working through topics in this way.
1 minute, John.
All right, and just in terms of assessments, one thing we've been recommending to colleagues is to put a statement on every assessment page about how generative AI tools can be used, if they can be used. And that's an example here. So basically it can be used as part of your assessment work in this course, but not as a way to take a shortcut. So there are some examples there of how they could use it in their assessment. All the assessments in this course do have templates as well. So I added this acknowledgement statement to their templates. So have you used any AI tools to help you with this assessment? Yes, no. And if yes, explain how. And there are some examples there for the sorts of things that they might write in there. And so far, taking this open and transparent approach does seem to be working. I'm actually less concerned about AI tools now than I was a few weeks ago. It seems like students have a pretty good grasp on what they can be useful for, but also what they should not be using them for. So hopefully that continues. So I'll hand over to Tam now to go through her course and what she's planning.
Thanks very much, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. As explained before, I coordinate the English Language Studies course at UniSA College. We have quite a large cohort of students, of domestic students who speak languages besides English at home. So enrolments in this course tend to range between around 150 to 200 students. So it's definitely a course that we need to have to support those students with their language development. If you're a language teacher like me, you may have felt a bit bamboozled since, ChatGPT launched and this proliferation of AI tools have come about. The focus in my course is really on getting students to develop their grammatical knowledge, their vocab, syntax, writing structures, etc., etc. And of course, this is problematic with genAI because, as we know, genAI has the capabilities to meet most of these course objectives. And from our experience, we've been able to see for ourselves that it can create quite fairly sophisticated text outputs. However, as John said before, it also does have its limitations. So I've really had to think to myself, right, what am I going to do to make sure that my students are still meeting those learning objectives and that I have assessment that is still valid for that learning? Thanks, John. So my approach in this course is to show students how language functions as a meaning-making system. And I feel it's important to expose students to a range of different text types and genres to show students how language is shaped to suit the situational context and to suit the register as well. You might be thinking, well, why is that relevant to genAI? I feel it's relevant because in order for us to teach students how to exercise that critical text analysis, they need to have an understanding of how language is structured for different text types. And so students know then how to critique and then how to engineer their prompts. Thanks, John. So UniSA College is actually going through a major program redevelopment next year rather. So I'm taking this as a good opportunity for me to think about how I'm going to integrate genAI into the curriculum and assessment design. One of the major assessment pieces will be a writing portfolio whereby students will engage in writing exercises in class. I need to emphasize that it will be in class each week, and then we will select pieces of those writings for the following week. And we'll use that for a live editing process. So getting the students to engage in a critical dialogue around the language features of the text that are up on the screen. I then will use what I'm calling a model, compare and critique approach, where we're going to look at outputs from genAI and then engage the class in that further critical discussion around that text analysis. So in turn, this is going to assist the students with their prompt engineering and encourage them to provide rationale for why they might need to re-engineer their prompts from thereafter. Thanks, John. Okay, so this is an example of a live editing process that I did just a couple of weeks ago where we worked on a paraphrasing task. So first we're looking at the student's output and talking about the language features and structures that might need to change or be adapted, and then comparing and critiquing that with the genAI model as well, looking at the two different registers of the two texts. Thank you, John. Thanks, John. Yeah. Another exciting prospect is the potential AI has for enabling translanguaging and culturally responsive pedagogy by providing tools and resources which can facilitate the use of multiple languages in the learning context. So, for example, AI can help teachers and students analyse and produce texts in different languages and in different modalities, and then create opportunities for dialogue and collaboration across those linguistic and cultural boundaries. There's been a lot of interesting research that has focused on this area of late. Kathleen Hugh from UniSA and her team have done a lot of exciting work looking at human translation technologies. And in fact, my colleague Min Pham and I at UniSA College experimented with translanguaging as an action research study in this particular course. So if you're interested in that, in those studies, please check out the references at the end. Thank you, John. And of course, there's other uses of genAI that we can consider rather for language development. We could use it to help students verbally articulate their arguments. I only did this in class this week, actually. We had a class debate on a very controversial topic. And first, I got the students to think about what would be the main points of their argument. And then we put the prompt into genAI. And that really helped the students see how their arguments could be further developed and built upon, and also got the students to consider points for rebuttal as well. And honestly, it was one of the most exciting classes I've had in a long time, and it was really, really very engaging. So I do encourage that for speaking practice, is to get the students engaged in a debate. so many language learning apps out there. Duolingo is probably a very popular one that you might be familiar with. Andy, Mondly. I use Duolingo to help me with my Japanese practice. I'm not so sure at this point how we're going to bring these tools into the language classroom per se, but because I find that their uses are more for sort of personal language tutoring, but certainly outside of the classroom where students can work with them and develop their self-regulation learning practices. I've also been using AI tools for text prompts and turning it into an image generation. Worked with some exciting activities looking at how we can develop students' vocabulary in class. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I'm happy to talk about that further.
About 1 minute, thanks.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, so just finishing up now. So I guess some suggestions I could make for academics in the short term is to really make sure that your assessment instructions and the relevance of those assessments are made very clear to the students. Always include details on acceptable AI use, not just in your course syllabus, also in your learning management systems, and having those very clear and transparent conversations in class with the students. And this is where I find that using genAI in formative learning tasks in the classroom is quite useful to provide that modelling and opportunities to students to see for themselves how it can be used ethically. And finally, if you're still sort of a little bit concerned about, genAI and the intersections with preserving academic integrity, one thing you might consider is making your assessment topics to be quite specific and personalised as possible. And I guess this kind of this goes into that authentic assessment umbrella area as well. So I'll finish there because I think I'm at my 6 minutes. Happy to answer any questions at the end of all of the presentations. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John and Tamara. I can see lots of really affirming comments in the chat saying that is such a positive approach. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure there'll be some questions later on for you. I'd like to introduce our next presenter now, Nick Pratt, who is a Pathways Advisor at the University of Notre Dame. Nick is presenting on using two-lane assessment design to support students to achieve learning outcomes. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Liz. So I'd just like to preface my part by saying I think a lot of the answers to the threat that AI poses to assessment actually lie in the past in fundamental psychological assessment theory and also in fundamentals of transition pedagogy and enabling pedagogy. So if we look at the benchmarked Common Learning Outcomes report from the association, we find two outcomes. One, cognitive skills to understand, analyse, synthesise and critically evaluate information. We can kind of interpret this as writing to learn or to demonstrate content mastery of information. The second one, academic literacy skills, fostering the written communication of ideas, theories and analysis. That's probably more learning to write, so accuracy, grammar, punctuation, word choice and academic style, conforming to academic style. So which one is it easier for a student to use AI to bypass to reach the learning outcome? I guess you could argue that the second one about academic style and learning to write is easier to bypass because AI is already inbuilt into Grammarly, it's starting to be inbuilt into Word and probably Google Docs as well. So a lot of commentators have argued we should be focusing on higher order thinking skills, such as we find in the first benchmark learning outcome, cognitive skills to understand, analyse, synthesise and critically evaluate information. However, and I think most enabling and bridging courses usually have process writing assessment, so usually a research essay. And this is a really good thing to demonstrate an ability and develop the ability to use cognitive skills in an integrated series of tasks. There's so much going on in process writing to reach a final essay or a final report. However, we find with AI that we have intelligence augmentation. So if students are outsourcing these type of cognitive skills, synthesizing, evaluating to the machine, then they may not develop critical life skills, essential to critical thinking and decisions. And we can argue that, universities in the broader liberal tradition, there's a role to develop the human capacity for thinking beyond being just the human in the loop of technology, or even to develop skills for the workplace. So that's a real threat. So I think this benchmarked learning outcome is excellent. That is fundamental, and it may not only relate to writing, it also relates to speaking and lots of different contexts and skills. So again, that fundamental question, validity, how can we be sure that the assessment design demonstrates what we say it does when these skills can be outsourced to machines? So we go back to kind of the granddaddy of psychological assessment theory, Messick. So he notes that one method to establish if an assessment performance is accurate is whether the performance is generalizable beyond the assessment performance itself. So he states that evidence of such generalizability depends on the degree of correlation of the assessed task with another task representing the same construct or the same learning outcome. And so this was done in 1995, but you see it appear in 2023 from Lewin and Bridgman. So they proposed the two-lane approach. So you have the same learning outcome, but you separate it into two tasks, or you have two assessments that relate to that test the same learning outcome. In lane one, you have the assured assessment, in-class contemporaneous assessment, Vivas, live simulation, supervised exam, or use of Google Docs that's monitoring the activity of the student as they're writing, so they can't cut and paste AI into it. Then in the second lane, you allow augmentation of intelligence, and you allow students to use AI along the way, so you can keep the same type of process writing approach, but maybe build in some critical or effective tasks. Then measure the convergent validity or the divergent validity. Do the scores add up? If the scores add up from both of those assessments, then you can be assured that you've prepared your students for what they'll face in the undergraduate situation or target degree. If they diverge from those two, probably got a problem. Is this a cynical view of students? So Lewin and Bridgman say we do not foresee a viable middle ground between the two lanes. It needs to be assumed that any assessment outside lane one that is unsecured may and will likely involve use of AI. Well, I guess we can go back to contract cheating and look at some of the research on that. It did show that if it's easy to cheat, if it's perceived that it's easy to cheat, students are more likely to cheat. And so I think it's great that AI has put contract writers out of a job, but has probably replaced them. But back to students and back to some of the things from the earlier two presentations, I think is lowering the motivation to cheat and also thinking about the role of the tutor. So one, collective teacher efficacy, that's highly effective for learning. So at your centre, do all your tutors agree about your approach to AI and assessment? I mean, that's really important. A tutor's walking into the classroom teaching something. If they don't believe in the approach, there's a problem, and students will be affected by that. Two,
about 1 minute, thanks, Nick.
No worries, as AI as an equity leveler and enabler, I think that's really important for enabling programs. It can help to level the playing field. Three, explicit design, that was covered earlier, making explicit how it should be used. Assessment for learning along the way rather than putting an exam at the end. And automated feedback, as you'll see again, that was covered. Making sure what are the challenges enabling students face when they're dealing with the language and feedback that AI is giving them. And finally, critical engagement. What can't AI do? What can humans do that AI can't, at least for now? Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. Some really great food for thought there. Lots of really important thoughts for us to be thinking about as we consider or reconsider how to design assessments. I think that's a really good, and lots of claps coming through I can see as well. I think that's a really good segue into our next presenter actually, because she's speaking on one of those lane one types of assessments that you mentioned. So our next presenter is Amita Kratlower, an educational designer in the Division of Learning and Teaching at Charles Sturt University, where she assists academics to design and develop new courses and revise existing ones to enhance student engagement and outcomes. And Amita's presentation is focused on introducing participants to an alternative assessment approach called the Interactive Oral Assessment IOAs, what it looks like in practice, and the academics and students' feedback on it. So thank you and welcome, Amita.
Thanks. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And let me just see this works. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I am going to be talking about our experience of implementing interactive oral assessments at Charleston over the last 2.5 years and what we have learned from our students and academic, and a little bit about how to design one as well. So an interactive oral assessment is a genuine and unscripted conversation between an academic and a student that is framed around an authentic workplace scenario. It offers opportunities to synthesize and extend student learning beyond other written materials and assessments. It ensures high level of academic integrity, and academics are satisfied with their students' knowledge and skills, which is an issue with other written assessments sometimes, and we have observed enhanced student engagement and outcomes. As a result, this is a very versatile assessment approach and can be implemented as a formative or a summative assessment, can be implemented as an individual or group assessment. It is really easy to design and manage, and it is scalable to large cohorts. That's one question I get every time. When we introduce an interactive oral assessment, we ensure that it is scaffolded within the subject, but it can also be scaffolded within the whole qualification. So what does it look like in practice? Here is a QR code that you can scan, and James is going to just post a link to my Padlet there in the chat box. It shows a range of scenarios that we have implemented in a variety of subjects as per discipline. And you will see, what you could use if you are thinking of one. So we have used a job interview scenario, performance review scenario, facing up to a translation committee for a language type of subject, or pitching your business plan to potential investors. So there are a lot of variety of situations that you can see are quite authentic to the discipline and makes it better for students to engage with the assessment task. So the design of this assessment task is based on this framework that was developed by the academics at Griffith University. And so that's what we have implemented. In the design process, if we ensure that the 6 key characteristics are included or designed in, we can be assured of the 3 key outcomes of enhanced student engagement, employability skills, and academic integrity. So quickly about the characteristics. One of the first things that we have to focus on is scaffolding and support. So like I mentioned, when we introduce an interactive oral assessment, we redesign all the assessments in the subject to scaffold to and from the interactive oral assessment to make sure that the students have very high chances of succeeding. We also develop a range of resources to support the academic as well as the student to make sure that it's a successful implementation in the first go. The second important thing is it should be scenario based. If there is no scenario, it's not an interactive oral. It will be end up in a traditional viva voce basket or a well-managed Q&A. It should be aligned to the program and the subject learning outcomes that the interactive oral is embedded in, and it should not disadvantage any student cohort. So we make sure that it's accessible and that students don't have any issues in participating successfully. It also should be professionally focused. And once we have made sure that all these characteristics are designed in, we can be assured of the outcomes of the interactive oral assessment. Once we have designed and start the process with the subject, we develop a few resources to support the students. One of the main resources that we develop for the students is a sample recording or a mock recording, where we get the academic to play the role of the student, and either one of their peer or myself will play the role of the academic. And we kind of simulate that around a different scenario from which the students are going to be assessed. It's a very good, showcase for students to see what it's going to look like for them. And by no way we make this as a perfect one, because otherwise the students will switch off. We incorporate common errors that students are likely to, encounter. So if they see that there is no penalty for that, it gives them the confidence and takes their stress level away as well. Once they have seen that, the second step is to get them to mark their academic against the marking rubric. Again, this is a very powerful exercise for students because it improves their assessment literacy. They know exactly what is expected of them. And when they mark, they generally tend to be harsher than the academic. So it's a very good talking point in class and works really well. We also have our academic skills team who have developed a special workshop for, students who will be experiencing interactive orals, where they help them prepare like exam tips. They give them tips on how to prepare for it on everything that is non-content related. So whether it's managing their time, managing their nerves, their breathing, eye contact, posture, anything to do with preparation. And that works very well as well. And we also design a lot of learning and practice activities. So once that's the upcoming assessment, and they have done this exercise, we get them to practice with their peers or with the academic in class, so they feel confident by the time they are ready to face their interactive oral.
About 1 minute.
Yes, very quickly. The student feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. They find the scenarios authentic, and that helps to engage with the assessment task. It improved their oral and communication skills. It helped them engage with the subject at a deeper level because they had to verbalize their learning, improve their confidence in dealing with different types of assessments, as well as, they love that opportunity to speak rather than have every assessment that's written. As for the academics, it gave them the confidence of the students' knowledge and skills and their readiness to join the professions. They felt that the feedback was truly heard. It improved the academic integrity as well as positively impacted on the teaching and learning strategies. And marking was much faster than other written assessments. So in conclusion, we find it did deliver on improving student engagement, their employability skills, as well as academic integrity. It helped to establish connection between staff and students, which in distance cohorts quite crucial. It helped us to accommodate student diversity. And based on our experience, we feel that we have, something that we can implement to address the academic integrity challenges posed by artificially generative tools like ChatGPT. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amita. Lots of claps again coming through. It was really great to see some models of how to do this form of assessment and feedback from students and staff on it. So thank you very much. We have one final presenter today before we'll get to some questions. So I'd like to introduce Michael Brickhill, who is the Academic Integrity Officer and College Connect Coordinator for SCU College at Southern Cross University. Michael will be showcasing a recently developed genAI practice guide used for student referrals to Southern Cross's academic integrity management system called AIMS when genAI appears to have been used inappropriately. So over to you. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Liz. So in terms of this genAI practice guide and how it fits into what we are doing at the university, well, it is part of the university's whole of institution response. As we're all too aware, the release of ChatGPT 4 in particular recently has raised and widened concern about its use and the impact of students' use of it and their access to genAI sites or software more broadly. We are not alone. Several universities have been revisiting and updating their policies in relation to academic integrity. It's a rapidly evolving situation, so as such, what I bring before you today could very well change in the next few months or indeed even weeks. So at SCU, what are we doing about it at the moment? Well, at a whole of institution level, we have made changes to online support materials for students and also changes to policies and procedures. Now, in relation to our online support materials, just left ahead once, our Centre for Teaching and Learning is currently adding and updating generative artificial intelligence information and building that into the mandatory academic integrity module that all of our new students must complete when they commence with us at Southern Cross University. And inside this mandatory module, which they can access from any unit learning site by clicking on the academic integrity link on the left there is a quiz that they must complete at the end where they will need to achieve a mark of 90% or greater. And content-wise, we have genAI that's going to be built into and added to the table of contents. So it's not quite yet ready, but it is coming, I am assured. In terms of policies and procedures, as an institution, we have updated our assessment, teaching and learning policy, the associated procedures that pivot off that in March and April of this year. We've also seen updates to our academic quality standards and integrity policy, also in April, and the academic integrity guidelines that pivot off that in May. More recently than that, still we have this genAI practice guide, which is supplementary to our academic integrity guidelines that was endorsed by our PVC for academic equality in June. This guide includes a list of signals for markers looking at assessment submissions made by students to look for any signals that might indicate potentially unacceptable use of genAI. Now, if a marker looking at a submission before them suspects that genAI has been moved beyond the accepted limits as defined in an assessment task description, or if it is permitted but it is being used in an inappropriate way, then they must look to the student's submission more deeply to gather evidence before deciding whether or not to refer the submission onwards for further investigation. And this is where I, as an academic integrity officer, come in. So in making the decision to refer or not to refer, the marker or indeed a unit assessor must see if whether one of these three conditions are met. Firstly, we have a student that has perhaps been informed in writing prior to putting the task in that genAI was not to be used in the task, and then there is further supporting evidence from a 9-point checklist to go with that. Second possibility, the student was informed in writing prior to submission that they may use genAI, but they have completed the task using genAI beyond the acceptable limit as defined in the assessment task, and again further supporting evidence from the 9-point checklist. Finally, the turned-in artificial intelligence report, so not the basic turned-in report itself, suggests or indicates a high probability percentage that a part of the student's submission may have been generated from AI. And then in addition, there is supporting evidence from that 9-point checklist, and indeed it appears that the student may have used genAI beyond limits that have been accepted within the assessment task description. So jumping inside these three possible conditions, well, if the student has used genAI where they were told that they could not, what sort of evidence do we need to perhaps then consider looking into this further? Well, first of all, the marker must include assessment information where the student has categorically been told that they must not and cannot use genAI for the task. And then beyond that, in addition, some evidence from the 9-point checklist. And that 9-point checklist is going to be the final slide that we will land on at the end of my 6-minute slot. The second scenario, where the student has perhaps used genAI beyond the acceptable limit as defined in the task. Again, we need the assessment task description where that is explicitly and clearly stated to the student and what limitations or boundaries have been set for the use of genAI. And then beyond that, evidence from the 9-point checklist. The third condition, where the artificial intelligence report within turned-in indicates a high probability percentage that parts of the assessment item has been generated through use of genAI tools, and there is sufficient additional evidence to support this.
About 1 minute, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So in addition to putting forth information from the task description, the various versions of the turned-in similarity report, a screenshot from the turned-in artificial intelligence report, and that 9-point checklist, the reason why we bundle all these additional pieces of evidence together is that we do not rely on the turned-in artificial report alone, standalone as a single piece of evidence to pursue a case. We need additional evidence on top of that. And that additional evidence may be drawn from this 9-point checklist here. Experience, not only at Southern Cross University, but other universities as well, tells us that we should not rely upon that turned-in artificial intelligence report as the sole basis for potentially referring a student for further investigation. Here we finish on our 9-point checklist, which a marker or unit assessor works their way down and compares the student's submission against these 9 points. They put in responses against each of these 9 points, and they then submit that up into the academic integrity management system. And at that point, it comes to me as academic integrity officer, and that is when I then take things forth with a student referral and potentially a conversation with the student. So there's an example of how, as a university SCU, we are at the moment addressing students beginning to use genAI, perhaps not in an appropriate way. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Michael. That was wonderful. I might pass over now to James.
All right. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone. As Liz said, there's been lots of positive responses in the chat to all the presentations, which is excellent. We had a question initially, fairly early on, from Daniel, I think directed to John and Tam, about are the units you're talking about credit bearing?
Hi, Daniel. Yes, they are. Yes, that's correct. So our Foundation Studies program is a year-long program where students have to undertake 8, we call them courses, or units as might be called in other institutions, but they have to undertake 8 of those courses. And yes, both of our courses are credit-bearing and part of that program structure.
All right, excellent, thank you. If you do have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. Amita, there was a good comments around the interactive orals, good scenario base. They're a good idea, but also a comment from Cynthia, depending on time constraints, that oral interactives could be an issue. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that.
Look, I'm not sure what that comment is referring to. If it is amount of time spent in doing the interactive oral, I can say the design process the first time can be a little bit time consuming only because the academics are learning as well. But where it comes to the implementation, like a 10 to 15 minutes time is sufficient or is equivalent to assess a 4,000 word essay. So it's quite efficient. Actually, it is not as time consuming as it may seem. And that's what many academics have found at Charleston, that it actually, as soon as you finish with the student, you can straight away mark in the rubric within the grade center and the marking is finished. So by the time they finish all the student interactive orals, the marking is finished as well. So I'm happy to clarify further if this didn't answer the question.
Cynthia's just put in a bit more detail. The time needed in class for oral presentations.
So it's okay. So it's not a presentation. We book these meetings depending on your scenario, one-to-one. You could be running it during the session or towards the end of the session. So you do a bit of preparing, which would be like normal part of your teaching and tutorial time. So there's nothing much additional that's required. And the running of the interactive oral can be done in the last week. In our situation, we can't run that during the exam period because it's not run by the exam office. So we run in the last week, depending if that's the last assessment and if it's a big cohort over the last 2 weeks. No, it doesn't take too much time at all.
Okay, and while you're talking, Amita, there's another question there which I might just jump to. How many different assessment tasks should be developed to make sure that students don't share tasks before they have their turn?
Look, so this is like a common concern. So it's not like if the first few students have done their interactive oral, they can go and share because it becomes unique for each student. So if it is linked to, let's say, their previous written component, what we ask the academics to do is use the gaps in their written work as conversation starters. So even if it's the same scenario, what work they have done and based on the prompt, what response they give, the discussion can go different ways. So there is no way for students to, first of all, come pre-prepared with a script and go and share their responses because it will be unique. And this is how we can accommodate the diversity of the students because depend on their cultural background, their personal experiences, work experiences, they can bring some of those things in the discussion. And we move the students slowly in the discussion from familiar to unfamiliar, where then they are, thinking on their feet, they have to apply what they have learned to resolve the unfamiliar situations. So it's not possible for them to go and share that with others. It won't matter anyway.
Okay, so do the oral assessment then follow on from the written assessment outcomes?
It can be, it depends on how we have designed the assessment. So that's one example. So in our situation, say there's one job handover scenario in that it was the same scenario for all students, and the academic has used it over multiple sessions, where it was about the incoming police officers getting a handover from the previous police officer and their experience of working with the local First Nations communities, and what worked for them and not. So it's quite positional. So it doesn't matter that it's the same scenario and it's not based on anything else. They can't just repeat that because they have to talk about their local community, and so it's unique to each student.
Right. Thank you, Amita. I'll let you off the hook now.
Thanks.
Michael's question for you: are the unit coordinators happy to complete the checklist and provide evidence? Workload is always an issue when reporting academic integrity issues.
Okay, thanks, James. Look, so far we haven't had too many cases where we have proceeded down this line, but where that has occurred, the unit assessors have certainly been happy and willing to fill out the checklist. The checklist is provided in advance so that unit assessors and indeed markers do have it ready to jump straight onto if they do suspect something doesn't look, looks a little bit questionable. So they can, pull down the relevant Turnitin bits and pieces. They very quickly work their way through those 9 points and just upload into the system as a single Word document.
All right, and as another question for you, Michael, is the practice guide you're referring to available to look at?
I will check with my colleague in Governance Services. I see no reason why we couldn't make it available, but I will need to check.
All right.
James, there's a
yes.
comment there. If you don't mind, I can talk to it by Chung about the
the
oral
last
assessment.
One. Yep. Go for it.
Yes, I just wanted to mention this is actually much different from other types of oral assessment, the interactive oral, because we do a lot of preparing of the students. They're supported all along the way. And the other important part of this is if the student gives a wrong answer or goes off track, the academic will just use a conversational prompt to bring them back on track or give them a hint so that they can fix if they have made an error, which doesn't happen with other oral assessment. There is no preparation, there is no response from the academic, like it's a poker face, and that causes students a lot of stress. So what the data that we have collected, students are not feeling as stressed about this because they were given ample opportunities to practice, prepare, and also they know if they make a mistake, as well as they can ask clarifying questions. They don't have to just depend on what the academic is asked because it's a professional conversation. They don't have to memorize everything. Depending on the scenario, they can look in their notes because in practice, you may not be required to memorize everything when you're having a chat with a professional colleague. So all these factors help students to see this in positive light, and they don't experience as much stress as compared to the normal type of oral assessment.
All right. Over to you now, John. Question to you from Stephanie. Would like to know, do all or most students engage with the AI to assist them in the ways that you've outlined within the assessment tasks? And an additional question, if there are students who don't want to use AI or maybe aren't good at using it, do you feel they're disadvantaged?
Yeah, thanks for that question. First bit is so we've had the first assessment submitted and most students did use AI in some way. The most common way was to help them refine their topic that they chose or their research question, which is not surprising because that's an activity that we had them have a go at. Another common way was just using Grammarly to help them with spelling and grammar, which I said was fine in this course. Just on that point as well, I might say that I am including Grammarly in their AI acknowledgement statement. Even though it's not generative AI, there is in the paid version of Grammarly, it does have generative capabilities. So I did want to put it in there also because that was the source of a lot of confusion about what was acceptable and what's not. So I thought I'd better address that there. Yeah, so most of them did use it to some extent. On the point about possible disadvantage, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think it's sort of the thing that really concerns me about assessments that require the use of AI. because I feel like there's always going to be a bit of an equity issue, because there's always going to be some paid versions of generative AI tools that are going to be a little bit better than the freely available ones. That's something that concerns me. So I haven't made using AI necessary or required. It's just an optional thing. And the way I've gone about it is basically they don't need to use AI in order to meet any of their assessment objectives. So I'm sort of trying to avoid that issue of disadvantage, because that is something that I do think about quite a lot. So I don't feel like they're really at a disadvantage. If they do want to use AI, the way I presented it in the assessments is this is sort of an optional extra thing that you can do, but there's certain required parts that you have to make sure that you do, and that's what we'll actually be assessing you on. So that's how I've gone about trying to manage that.
Right, and if you can answer this question, John, very quickly, then we can move to wrapping up. How do we improve deep learning as we continue to use AI as the new normal?
That was for Nick, I think.
I think that
oh,
one.
Sorry, Nick. Yes, sorry.
I think it's a new normal maybe for writing, but I think Tamara or John in their presentations and Amita in the oral presentations, if you're including a different form, a lane 1 assessment that is controlled, you can kind of ensure that you've got that deep cognition and you're testing it, as well as having a lane 2 where you're using AI. So I think it is important to have some type of controlled assessment. I think Amita's is a really good example of that. So if you tie that to written assessment with AI, you've got the new normal in one lane, and then the other lane tied to it, you've got an oral assessment at the end, or a Viva. And there's lots of great examples there.
All right. I think we're going to have to start to wrap things up now. Before we do, though, I thought we would actually give ChatGPT the final say on this topic. So we asked ChatGPT to write a paragraph about effective assessment design in the age of genAI that ensures students in Australian enabling programs are able to meet learning outcomes. And this is what it told us.
In the age of generative AI, effective assessment design for Australian enabling programs has become a crucial endeavour to ensure that students are meeting their intended learning outcomes. Leveraging the capabilities of AI, educators can craft assessments that not only measure knowledge acquisition but also
We just lost the audio, or I just lost audio there.
evaluate a student's ability to apply that knowledge in real-world contexts. These assessments should be dynamic and adaptable, taking advantage of AI's ability to generate personalized questions and scenarios tailored to each student's unique learning journey. Furthermore, educators must maintain a balance between formative and summative assessments, providing ongoing feedback to students while also gauging their overall progress. Additionally, ethical considerations regarding AI-driven assessments, such as data privacy and algorithmic bias, should be addressed to ensure fairness and transparency in the evaluation process. Ultimately, effective assessment design in the era of generative AI empowers Australian enabling programs to foster a more personalised and inclusive learning environment, where students can truly demonstrate their mastery of essential skills and knowledge. In the age of generative
I don't think we need that one twice. But yes, ChatGPT certainly seems to think there's a role for generative AI in future assessment, but I'll let you ponder what that means. But I just want to finish up today saying thank you so much to all our presenters today. So much food for thought there. I've got lots of good ideas out of today's session. Liz, did you want to add a thank you?
Oh, yes, just to echo everything that James said. Thank you so much. It was really inspiring and informative.
The recording is going to be available on the Nair website, and we'll look at making slides available there too, if we can do that. But if you are interested in continuing the conversation about assessment and generative AI, I encourage you to contact either myself or Liz to join the Enabling Assessment SIG. So we'll be organising a meetup towards the end of October, and I'm sure generative AI will be one of the big topics there that we will be talking about in that SIG. So thank you for coming today, everyone, and I hope you've got a lot out of today's session. And yeah, we'll see everyone in the next NAE webinar.